everyone here. Well, I wish I could see you. I know you can see me, but beautiful day here in Minnesota. We've got some snow and sunny, but happy Friday. So thank you for being here this morning. I'm Kathy Rabideau, Market President and Publisher of the Minneapolis-St. Paul Business Journal, and I'd like to welcome you to MSPBJ's seminar, Courtside Activism. As a former basketball player, I'm super excited about this and love the tide of sports. So our mission at the Business Journal is to bring you the news and information you need to grow your business and be more competitive, and this discussion is a part of our mission. I would like to point out the chat, which can be opened by clicking on the chat bubble in your toolbar at the bottom of your screen. This can be used to connect directly with other attendees or with people at your table. You can also share feedback with all the attendees in the general chat. We will have time for Q&A with the panel, so please enter your questions at any time throughout the discussion in the Q&A tab. I would like to give a special thank you today to our sponsor and our partner on this event. Thank you to our presenting sponsor, RSM. We could not do this event without you today, so thank you. I also want to recognize that all ticket proceeds from today's event are being donated to the Minneapolis Foundation. And that's not all, because RSM is adding to this donation to make it equal to $10,000. Thanks again, RSM, for being such an amazing advocate for equity and inclusion in our community. Now, I am very excited to introduce you to today's moderator. Please welcome Tracy Walker, Senior Director, Government Affairs and Culture, Diversity, Inclusion at RSM. Hi, Tracy.
Hello, Catherine. Thank you so much for that warm welcome. And hello, everyone. We are so excited to have this, what has become an annual discussion on the subject of inclusion. There's much to talk about. We have an amazing panel convened for you. So welcome again to Courtside Activism, Fostering Equity and Inclusion from Our Seats. It's going to be a great conversation. Now, as you may have become aware, the slides are available for you to follow along with our conversation, or you may just want to take notes, be engaged, and receive the slides afterwards, but that's certainly an option for you as well. So thank you for joining us. Thank you, Catherine, for that great introduction. And of course, the Minneapolis-St. Paul Business Journal, our great partner in this conversation, for hosting us. So we want to get started, and just before I bring up our great panel, which you can see on slide 2, I just wanted to mention that we are trying to convene diverse perspectives so we can all learn best practices around diversity and inclusion. So when the panel comes up, they'll introduce themselves and give you a bit of perspective from their lens. So we're excited to have each of them with us. First, we thought it was important to acknowledge we're in challenging times these days. We're dealing with COVID, we're dealing with political discourse and divisiveness, and we have to acknowledge some of the challenges around race and social justice and the things that have challenged us outside of our organizations as well as inside. So the slide on your screen, we've defined structural racism, institutional racism, what's interpersonal, and the things we internalize. That has to do with the things we allow and the things we do not allow, which essentially means we have the power to drive inclusion despite circumstances. So we'll explore that a little bit as well. On the reflection side, slide 5, you'll see how the sports teams have reacted, how the community has taken to the streets in some cases, and all of the discord that people carry inside and outside the organization. The map of the US shows us that there have been actions and activities that have touched us in each of our locations, in our offices, so that absolutely impacts our employees and how they come to work. But just a bit of foundational history, which some of you asked for in our last conversation. So from an African-American lens, if we've had 265 years of slavery, roughly 1625 to 1825, and then 1865, I'm sorry, and then 100 years of legalized segregation and oppression and discord. The distance in the time that we've spent working on inclusion has been relatively short. So going through the slides on historic perspectives, you'll see that journey a little more pronounced, including when women were allowed the right to vote in the 20s. And so it's been a short time that America has really moved with intention around inclusion. So you'll see it show up in our workplace, and you see the progression from managing diversity to an inclusive workplace. And so we want to find out, where is your organization today, if you think about that? I'd like to bring our panelists up at this time, and we're going to talk to them and hear from them about where they find their maturation on the arc of inclusion, and how they have begun to navigate this challenging time. So since Eric, you are the first to arrive on stage, I think I'd like to go to you first. So tell us what's happening. Tell us about you, your role, what's happening in the Best Buy world as it relates to this new now, the recent events, the political, the COVID factor. Can we start with you?
Sure. Well, first of all, Tracy, just a pleasure to join the panel, and thank you for moderating today. Having done so, I know how challenging it can be and how rewarding it can be at the same time. You know, I would tell you that the environment that we've all been operating in is probably the most intense that any of us have experienced in our careers, because, you know, you sort of have this perfect storm between the pandemic, social unrest, lots of things happening when you think about the climate, from hurricanes to wildfires. And then you add in that dynamics that we've never had to experience before, like, you know, having to work from home and school from home. And so it's just been what seems like a never-ending series of challenges in a very constrained period of time.
Sure.
And so our companies have become microcosms of our external environment. And every leader has had to become an expert in human resources and inclusion and diversity almost overnight. And for myself, both in my professional relationships, but also in some of the nonprofit work I do, and even at home as I work with my children and family, everyone's looking for answers on, like, how do we work through this?
Yes, and we'll have a lot of conversation about that. And did you mention what it is you do in your exact jurisdiction and title?
Yeah, so my official title is Director of Inclusive Cultures at Best Buy, and my responsibility is enterprise-wide, but it's focused on identifying and curating learning experiences around inclusion, diversity, and equity for the organization, and then providing spaces for people to learn our inclusive leadership behaviors and exercise allyship, primarily through our inclusion groups. And many organizations would recognize those as ERGs or BRGs, so employee resource group or business resource groups. And we have several different variations of those across our enterprise.
Fantastic. Thank you, Eric. Anne, would you like to go next and introduce yourself, and how are we dealing with this new now, including the recent racial events, people, political climates, and so on?
Yeah.
What's your perspective?
Tracy, thanks again for having me. So Ann Dicey, hi everyone. I lead business integration for US Bank, situated in the Twin Cities market, and really happy to be here today. So my role is really twofold. I lead all of the data and metrics as it pertains to DEI, and I'm sure we'll get a chance to talk about data as we go. Such an important piece of DEI, as we all know. I also lead our champion program. So we have champions aligned with each of our business units, and they're really charged with serving as ambassadors, influencers, and architects for the DEI strategy that we lead. They're very senior leaders, and so, really not only championing the work from a talent perspective, but also and Eric, you mentioned this, what does inclusive leader look like? And how do we model that inclusivity, especially now at such a time where we're all, stuck at home, virtual environments can be limiting. Some of us are, Bryce, you and I had a chance to kind of talk before in the networking, we've got kids at home, Eric too. And so I think, Eric, I think you're right. I think it really is, DEI has had a place at the table, I think, more so than I've ever seen it before. We're part of, all sorts of decisions related to work from home, our folks, especially with us in the branches that still have to go into work and serve customers. Those are all, when it comes down to it, there is DEI decision making to be had there. And I look forward to chatting a little bit more about that as we get into it.
Thank you so much, Ann. Exciting things at US Bank. Bryce, your thoughts?
Hi, Tracy. Hi, everyone. Bryce Fish. I lead diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy at Ryan Companies. I'm in my home in St. Paul, but our headquarters are in East Downtown Minneapolis. And much of what Eric and Ann shared, 100% agree. I think for us, our new now is understanding that many of our team members are anxious and stressed and frightened and are looking for places at work to share those concerns and to celebrate some of the things that are bringing us together as well. As hard as these past months have been, we are building some, I think, deeper, more authentic, stronger relationships as well. And we've been more focused on mental health than we have in the past as well.
Sure. Fantastic. Ryan, how about you, the new now?
Yeah. Thank you, Tracy, and thank you, Tracy, and everybody for having me. It's a privilege and honor to spend some time with you guys. Ryan Tankey, I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the Minnesota Timberwolves and Minnesota Lynx organization. Eric, what you said, I mean, it hit home of just, this has been, you hear the word unprecedented all the time, but when you start to thread together what we're all, living, leading, parenting through, it really is pretty remarkable, the way the resiliency of just everybody and the way that we're banding together in this important moment in time. And we talk every day, 2020 is certainly one of the most challenging years any of us are ever going to go through, we hope. And yet it also might be the most important that we go through. And so if you think about this community and you go back 8 or 9 months to the beginning of the pandemic and what we've all had to do and pivot, and certainly our organization by nature has leaned into the pandemic fight, but then just weeks later, a month later, you're jumping into something that we all knew was important relative to racial and social inequalities. And lucky to work for a league and leagues with the WNBA and NBA that have, I think, been champions in leaning into this for a long time. You'll hear from Coach Reeve in a little bit, and if you haven't heard her before, you're in for a special treat on this topic. She's a remarkable leader and has been, at the forefront of this conversation for a long time. So, you shift from a pandemic to, the killing of George Floyd, and I think even the folks on this panel, we've all believed and have been leading this, but it shook the core a little bit, and I think there's an opportunity there for all of us to just realign and maybe dream bigger, think bigger, and establish goals in that. And then very similarly, because of this community, I'm in a downtown Minneapolis right now where there's some real public safety challenges, but there's also some real public safety perception challenges that are very different than the reality. So we've got work to do on all of those fronts as we go forward.
We do, and I look forward to exploring what the panel feels are some of those great unifiers. And I always think of sports being something where, you know, we can all come together and rally around our favorite team. But then we get into different environments and our perspectives change and, you know, that sort of thing. So look forward to more on this conversation. And of course, our great keynote. Thank you for mentioning that, Ryan. Philomena, would you introduce yourself as we move forward into the discussion?
Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being patient. I've had some tech issues this morning.
We're glad to see you. We're happy you made it. So just tell us about you and how you're coping with the new normal.
Yes. So I'm Philomena Morsi-Sater, and I lead diversity and inclusion at Land O'Lakes. And I caught, I think, most of what people have said, but I'll say, you know, a few more. We're a co-op, and so we work with and for our farmers, and there are a lot of additional challenges for people across the country in rural communities. And so today I'm having trouble getting on with my internet, but people in rural communities face that every day. So when you look at some of the challenges of COVID with healthcare and mental health and well-being, not having access to that. So just kind of a different dimension, I think, with virtual learning for school-age children. You know, for those of you that might be parents, we're paying close attention to that with the impact of virtual learning and parents working in, and how do we do this, elder care, you know, a lot of these challenges that have just been heightened in addition to, you know, the racial tensions across the country. So I don't want to be repetitive, but I agree with my colleagues here on the panel and look forward to the discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much. Great perspective so far. We're going to move ahead for those of you following along with the slides, and we're going to talk about inclusive plays, to use a sports analogy. The first level of understanding has to do with intersectionality, which means understanding that we all come from different perspectives and backgrounds foundationally. There's the things we can't control, like our age, our nationality, gender, that sort of thing. And there are the things that we do control in terms of our education, our expertise, our faith, things like that. But all of it informs who we are. So these things come in, and then our actions and beliefs somewhat follow. So thinking about diversity, diversity might be, if we're staying with the sports analogies, the different skills that the athletes have and strengths and how that plays out in terms of what they execute and how they execute. But inclusion is making that mix work such that all of the athletes work cohesively together and form a team that can accomplish mission, win championships, and so on. So you can also think of it I'm a foodie, so in terms of ingredients and then the mix that ends up making the cake. But however you look at it, diversity is valuable, but it's even more valuable when you pair it with inclusion. So inclusion is the process of change. Inclusion is an action word, and it really comes from the experiences that we have with each other. So we know that that's foundational. So if diversity is the mix of our differences, intercultural competency is how we make the mix work so that we get to inclusion. And there's a lot of competencies in our panel here today. Just a couple of quick thoughts. Harvard University says, very much like high school cafeteria, sometimes there's an in-group and an out-group in our organizations. And the out-group represents risk, turnover, attrition, that sort of thing. So we want to get to a new normal, and organizations can intervene. So the panel has outlined all of these things that have taken place outside the walls of our organizations. But inside the organizations, we have an opportunity to make that mix work. And when we do, employees are 29% more engaged. They're much more likely to be creative, 47% more creative, 41% feeling that they belong and more likely to stay. So these are important factors. So that brings me to the next question for the panel. What are some of the calls to action based on the current state? What actions should we be taking, could we be taking, that are really going to drive that mix of inclusion and get us to the important outcomes? And as it relates, have you run into any challenges? And if so, why are these things challenging? And this time I'll start with you.
Sure. Thank you, Tracy. Gosh, what do I think about that question? One thing we've done differently over the past year is really look at the role of a leader, and I mean leaders of people, and said you're a really important part of this DEI journey for us. You make the hiring decisions, you decide who's on the interview panels, you are charged with developing your talent, and those are all ways that we can foster diversity. Diversity just is, right? Like, we have diversity, we got to do something with it in order to drive the innovation, Tracy, that you're talking about. And so we've, for the past year and a half, we've put all of our leaders of people, and we're still on this journey, through an inclusive leader program. And it's completely virtual now. It was about a half a day face-to-face, so we transitioned to 2 hours virtual this year. And that's really, I think, set a baseline for here's what we expect of you as leaders. Adopting inclusive behavior is a value of ours, but holding leaders accountable to that is something different.
Yes.
And it's important for them to model behavior. So we're still on that journey of coaching them, but I think it also comes down to the data, right? I think we're well beyond sort of this business case for diversity. The bank, we talk about, 90% of the growth in our footprint is going to come from multicultural consumers. So it's game over, right? This is how we innovate. If we don't have people that mirror the communities that we serve, whether it's in the branches or on the phones or at all levels of the organization, we're actually not we're not powering our own potential.
That's right.
So I think
a lot of people are, just to add to that, a lot of people are scared of data because it may say things about the organization that they really either don't believe or don't want shared. So kudos to you for being courageous around that.
It is.
Absolutely. Philomena, did you have a thought on the actions that we need based on the current state and some of the challenges that go with them?
Yeah, so a couple that I'll add on, and I appreciate the comments. As we look at our organizations, who are the voices that we hear? So at Land O'Lakes, we have kind of three populations. We have headquarters, and we have 80 plants and facilities, and then we have people who work directly with our farmer owners. And I've been at Land O'Lakes 3 years, so we've been looking at how do we engage and how do we support employees throughout the organization. And one of the populations that had been overlooked were people who work in our plants. They cannot call in to an hour-and-a-half learning session. They've got 15 minutes. So I think coming up with solutions for different populations so everyone feels like they have a voice and are included. So we worked with a vendor to develop what's called bite-sized learning. So it's 15 minutes or less. And that kind of the fun part is the supervisors and managers go through the training and then they train their teams. And it's over 5 months. There's a topic per month. And we have had just such great feedback from employees saying, hey, thanks for caring about us. And thanks for designing something, not just a rework, but something specific for them. And so I think that's a really important piece of inclusion as well.
Yes. And how innovative. We talk equality versus equity. Equity is meeting people where they are and giving them what they need. So it's not one size fits all. So how innovative and wonderful that there's something for everyone in this conversation. So we've got accountability, we've got innovative ways to deliver learning. So Eric, very briefly, can you bring us home with something that Best Buy is doing that is helping address the new now in terms of action?
For sure. Two things I want to touch on that was mentioned earlier. One is around data. I think data is important. When you think about from 1980 to 2017, BIPOC or Black, Indigenous, people of color communities went from 20% to almost 40% of the country. And by the year 2045, that number is supposed to tip into the majority. Where that exactly lands, we just know we're close to it. And organizations are just not prepared for this cultural shift. And there's a quote from Stephen Covey that I use a lot in my organization and other organizations I work with, is that culture eats strategy for breakfast.
Yes.
And so even though we have really compelling data, lots of passion and energy around this, you have to understand what are the cultural barriers or norms within your organization that are either going to prevent or slow down this work. And you have to address the culture first. And so a lot of what I heard, especially from Ann, is like, how are they transforming their culture to create an environment where you can actually make progress in this work? And if you don't address the cultural things, and that's what we're focused on very heavily at Best Buy right now, is how do you address the cultural barriers that exist within your organization that prevent inclusive behavior and actually make it so diversity actually can't be leveraged in a way that propels progress and innovation?
Absolutely. What great points. And it's a perfect segue to our next section, which is business. There is a business case for all of this, including the accountability and including putting culture first. So for those of you following along, we want to talk about that business case. First, there's a science to this. Maslow, who we remember from college with his hierarchy of needs, it used to be fundamental: food, shelter, water. Would you believe that belonging, the sense of belonging, is now the most fundamental in terms of, you can see people on Facebook trying to get likes and make connections, but it shows up in the workplace. This sense of belonging is so critical. And to Eric's point, Atlanta is one of the first cities to be majority minority, and there will be other environments as well. And so are our companies prepared for this? The CEO Action organization has put together a bunch of CEOs to address this. But one of their main tenets is to have complete and sometimes difficult conversations. So what bridges that gap and helps drive belonging are those conversations. So I have a little cartoon here that shows our tiny little comfort zone versus the huge space outside of it where the magic happens. And so we want to get comfortable reaching for that magic. And yes, there's fear first, but then we get into learning and then we get into growth. So it is a bit of a personal journey that drives business, but there's a new IQ. So I want the audience to think about what actions is your organization taking to drive inclusion and to appreciate characteristics, perspectives, beliefs of your employees to drive that sense of belonging for them. I think it's an important part of our conversation. So panel, now we're going to get to a lightning round, little fun part. I'm going to ask you a question, and then I'm going to ask you to choose an answer, okay? And audience, the panel doesn't know what this question is, so we're going to really help them getting their inclusive reflexes together. So courtside action is our theme. So you are leading a diverse team of differing staff levels and functions who are not performing cohesively. So recent events, political, social, have divided them. What action do you take to address and manage the discord to get to a good outcome for your team? So the first option is A, identify and remove the bad actors from the team, allowing some harmony. Okay, so getting rid of the bad actors. Option 2, have the team attend unconscious bias training. Option 3, host a courageous listening session to achieve understanding and build trust. And the last option is revisit the team mission, asking everyone to just put your personal views aside for the good of the business. So again, remove the bad actors is A. Have the team attend unconscious bias is B. Host a courageous conversation to build understanding and trust, or ask them to put their beliefs aside and just focus on the business. So we're going to start with Bryce. Bryce, what's your first action? And again, this is lightning round. So rapid fire answer and explanation. So what are you doing to help your team, Bryce?
So I hope I have this right. I would say courageous listening.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. And why did you choose that? Quickly.
Very quickly, that's what we've been doing at Ryan as well. Ever since George Floyd's murder, every 2 weeks, we've been having those sessions, every office across the country, very specifically around racial equity. And they're hard and they're scary, and we're having important conversations.
Yes, yes. Anyone choose a different answer? Raise your hand.
Nope.
No, everyone chose host a courageous listening session to achieve understanding and build trust. Philomena, why is that such an important answer for you?
Sorry, I just missed that last part, Tracy.
I was just asking why did you choose C, the courageous listening?
Yeah, because I think a lot of times we jump to assumptions and think we understand the problem, but what is underneath, when they say underneath the iceberg. And then I think about, like, we did some listening sessions too when we were trying to identify high turnover with our Black and African American employees. And I think when you do that, also be really intentional about who facilitates. So we did co-facilitation. So myself and one of the leaders from our African ancestry group to be able to open up the door and have employees feel much more comfortable to share what is the truth. So C was my answer.
And Eric mentioned Stephen Covey and the foundation. He's got obviously the speed of trust, but I told him he should write the speed of inclusion, because trust is at the foundation of inclusion in so many ways. Ryan, did you have a thought on that? Teams have to trust each other, right? So I'm sure you have a perspective on teamwork.
It is one of the most beautiful things, I think, that came from the unfortunate events around George Floyd. It's just the way people came together and leaned into what would have been really tough conversations prior, right? And I think you saw people, regardless of gender or race or backgrounds, listening and having what would have been really tough and maybe even taboo conversations with each other. And so the listening part, I thought was real, and it was authentic. And I think real positive change, long-term change, came from those conversations. And then learning and just being willing to learn. And the number of individuals and organizations who, looked at books and documentaries and all kinds of opportunities to educate. Everybody that's here has an interest in diversity. You signed up to come to this event, or you're on a panel. Like, it's understanding the difference between diversity and inclusion. It's looking at the difference between equality and equity. And even, individually is somebody that I've taken pride in this space, but looking in the mirror and self-reflecting around opportunities for me as a white man to get better every day in and amongst all of these challenges. It's all about understanding and finding common ground.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ryan. And Anna, I saw that you picked C as well. So this is why they pay you guys the big bucks and you're in the roles that you're in, because you all chose correctly. So we have a lot that we can learn from you. And I just wanted to mention a couple of things on the business note. So employees with firms who work for organizations with inclusive culture are 45% likelier to report growth in the market, 70% likelier to capture new market share. So there is a business case for that. And slide 31 has some stats on business and behavior. So we're talking about, outperforming your peers, lower turnover rates, greater productivity. But when it comes to the behaviors, if you don't have an inclusive culture and your employees have to come to work covering, which is the term for not being your authentic self, on the slide, it shows some of those consequences and how it hits groups hard. The LGBTQ plus group, 80%, 79% African Americans. In the 60s, women of color, all women, and the Hispanic Latinx community, and even almost 50% straight white men. So it could be what college you went to or what the culture of your environment is, but everyone experiences that. So we're on a journey from unconscious bias to consciousness. Then from being conscious of our bias, we can consciously include. So 2 points on consciousness. And then finally, inclusion should become unconscious. So we go from unconscious bias to unconscious inclusion. And we have to disrupt some mindsets. We have to change some mindsets. We have to live some new behaviors to get to that unconscious inclusion. But it shows that teams that go from good to great have a real powerful foundation for leadership, recognizing not only diversity, but the value of inclusion as well. So let's get to the next question. And Bryce, I'm coming to you first on this. What are the calls to action that we have around authenticity and creating this inclusive culture and the people dynamics? What do you think are some of the things that we can do that are people-centric that leaders can do to help get them from good to great from a business perspective?
I'll share personally, and you know, I think Ryan, you touched on this a little bit as well. I think so much of this, and I hear this theme of education and greater awareness of ourselves and others. And at Ryan, you know, construction and real estate is a largely white male industry, or at least it has been historically, and that certainly is changing. We're focusing a lot on allyship, and specifically, of course, we can all be allies to each other, but specifically, if an organization is white male majority, what can that group do to, one, understand their own culture and identity, and then two, build that intercultural competence that you mentioned earlier. All of our leaders went through the intercultural development inventory, and then a year of learning after that. And that's wonderful, and we're doing lots of other education, but then it's okay, how do you take that to action? So how can you actually build personal individual goals with each leader and make sure that they come from a place of authenticity, right? And those goals will differ for each person. What's important to them? What does their team look like? What are their what do they do outside of work as well? How can you connect some of the community work that they might be doing with the work that you're doing with our customers and with our employees as well? So that's where we're at right now. We are setting certainly goals to increase, you know, representation within Ryan as well, but as important is how can we create some of those inclusion goals? And I think Annie, you kind of talked about this earlier as well, for each leader, so that they can develop their inclusivity. We're still figuring it out, certainly, and I'm still figuring it out, right? You know, I mess up every single day, and I think, and that's part of it. It's what you do after you make that mistake, so that you don't repeat it.
Absolutely. So, Brian, and then Anne, I'll ask you, is inclusion good for business in your view? And why do you believe so, if so?
Yeah, I mean, one, you know, it's been talked about data. I mean, just leaning into data and facts. It's, you know, you're here because you believe it's the right thing to do. We all believe it's the right thing to do, but it's also the smart thing to do. And, you know, that's proven out just in the way decisions get made as we speak. You know, we've got the NBA draft on Wednesday night. Our, you know, incredibly diverse group from Gerson Rosas, our president of basketball operations, and the team he's assembled, it's remarkably diverse. And the conversations that happen and the points of view from people who, don't look like, don't think like, and come from different backgrounds. Like it's proven out time and time again. And one of the things I wanted to share is just, to the point of data. And I think this is the hard part for companies, because it doesn't feel good maybe at first if you're just beginning a journey, is what gets measured gets done. And, and running a large organization, you have a lot of things on your plate every single day, and you're trying to grow the business. No different than you would look at a sales report or marketing dynamics. You've got to look at the data and have strategies to get there. And I think I talked about what I thought was some of the beautiful things that have come together. I think one of the challenges that we all probably felt was you wanted to sprint, in June, and everybody wanted to do so much. And I think you quickly realized that you're not going to fix something overnight that has been so systemic and long lasting. And so we had to zoom out and look at a long-term strategies and, take a very long view on that. And then how are we going to march towards that every day in a measurable way?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that kind of strategic view makes it sustainable for sure. Anne, did you have a thought on that? The impact bottom line.
Absolutely. Inclusion's important. Yeah, I think if inclusion's important, though, we have to drive accountability, Ryan. I think you're totally right. And I think we have to be able to show leaders what success looks like, and be much more prescriptive than I think we ever have before if we really want to accelerate the work. So we're starting to build at the bank 5-year aspirations. Where do we want to be 5 years from now? Really working hard to articulate what the key levers are for how we actually get there from a workforce standpoint. Coaching leaders on those levers as well, because I think sometimes we presume that they know. And this is a really new muscle that a lot of people have not flexed before. And so I think it's a really important role that DEI plays, and quite frankly, leaders play in driving that success and inherently more innovation. And I think just better outcomes and more belonging. That's the outcome that we're looking for ultimately, is belonging.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let's wrap with some action before we get to the point of taking questions. Ginny Romedy, the executive chair of IBM, just a powerful force in terms of executive leadership. Her quote is, "I've learned to always take on things I'd never done before. Growth and comfort do not exist," which harkens me back to a quote I also like from Frederick Douglass: "Fear and faith cannot occupy the same space." So she's essentially saying the same thing. And what the data show is that managerial involvement, mentor, and sponsorship has a 58% impact as to whether you retain your top talent or whether they go elsewhere and can be recruited away. So let me ask you this question. What is the desired future state? What will be the personal, professional pillars of this change? What actions happen forward, sort of inside the business, to satisfy the personal need to do something that all of us have been feeling, and change in a meaningful and sustainable way? So we did hear the data can be a driver for that. There's a carrot and stick philosophy around getting people to be more inclusive and more conscious. But I'm interested in your answer. Future state, Anne's given us her 5-year goal, but what does that look like for us? Philomena, would you start? And then I'll go to you, Eric.
Yeah. I was just thinking about how do we integrate diversity and inclusion, have our employees feel like we're doing something and taking action. And so I think here's a great example. We have a community support campaign that I'm sure many organizations have. And we have historically worked with the United Way. This year, we're like, hey, we want to send a strong message that we want to support social justice, racial equity organizations, and we have a focus on hunger. How do we figure out how to feed the world? So our employees could still support the United Way And then we had 10 organizations, 5 focused on racial equity, social justice, 5 focused on hunger. And those 10 organizations had organizational match dollar for dollar up to $350,000. So it was like a strong message to employees, like this is important. Here's a tangible action. We worked with our employee resource groups to help identify some of those organizations. And so I think people felt really good about the options. So that's just one example.
Absolutely. Great example, by the way. And partnering with charities demonstrates a purposefulness that is so important. And I don't know about you, but so many of our clients and stakeholders or what have you are looking for the corporate level accountability. So how do you show up in the communities where you do business? What does that look like? And how can we believe that inclusion is a part of the fabric of who the company is? And so, Eric, what does the future state on this issue look like for Best Buy?
Yeah, so one of the things that's very important for me, I know for our leaders as well, is that, Ryan, you touched on this as well, we're facing really systemic problems, both in our country, but also in our organizations. Yet we don't approach this work the same way we would as we were talking about, customer sentiment or, margin issues or, run rates, you pick the metric. And so we have to address these systemic problems with systemic solutions. You can't fix them at the symptom level, which I think in inclusion, equity, and diversity space, you see the symptom and you might put the Band-Aid there, but you don't get deep enough into what is the root cause and put in the work to fix issues that have existed for decades or maybe even centuries in some cases. The next part is, you've got, after you've identified the sort of source of the issues, you got to stay focused on leadership engagement. Is there policies that need to be fixed, processes, education, oversight? And you heard accountability probably 5 or 6 times in the last 3 minutes. Mm-hmm. And leaders have to really be engaged. And by engaged, I mean, like, they got to be all in. The senior leadership team has to be aligned. You can't have anyone who's a bystander. And they got to be really clear on where the organization stands on this issue. And they have to drive the topic and the culture with their teams. It's not enough for them to just publicly make these statements. They have to go back into their individual meetings and continue to drive the change down. So you don't end up with that gap between what the employees are saying they need, what communities are saying they need, and where senior leadership is at. That's what actually helps you penetrate across what I call the critical middle. Some may call them the frozen middle, but I think that's the most critical group and the group we need the most.
Yes. The group that's most resistant to change and start to break that down. And going back to the timeline for the audience's sake earlier, we talked about that this change hasn't been sort of legally and from a public policy perspective and even business norms, it hasn't been addressed until the most recent 50 or so years. So if you raise your hand, if you know someone who's 56 or older, this was not a part of their natural culture previously. It does represent a change. And there is a block of middle management or what have you that's referred to as the frozen middle, because getting them to let go of some of the older beliefs and embrace some of the newer beliefs is a challenge. And we think experiential learning is one way to address that. But did you have a follow-up, Eric?
Yeah, the only other thing that I would add to that is, I think everyone in this call has talked about inclusive leadership. And people just don't understand, like, how do I engage, how to do this work? And so we've really leaned in on building this model around vulnerability, empathy, courage, and grace. And how do people practice it? And I think each organization has to identify what does that look like within their culture and develop the right common language and behaviors and ways of teaching that to their leaders to see long-term systemic change.
I love that. I love grace. Extending grace to people is a lost art. So, Bryce, what are your thoughts on this question?
At Ryan, we're certainly building out 5-year goals as well, and we're trying to think as boldly as possible while uncovering all those systemic issues that we have within our organization. And some of those, we had a racial equity task force that we formed. They presented their recommendations to our executive leadership team just 2 weeks ago, and those are under review. But we know right now, if you look at the makeup of our organization, we don't mirror our communities, and that's a big problem. So how can we, within 5 years, get as close as possible to get there? So some of the goals that we're looking at for our next round of interns, 40% people of color. We don't know how we're going to do that yet, but very different than saying, okay, let's increase by 1 or 5 or 10%. Let's think really big and make it happen. And then I would just add, personally as well, success for me in 5 years. I have 3 boys, one's Black, one's Latino, one's white. I would want them to be able to look at Ryan or any organization and say, I can see myself there. I can see I have a path. And right now, that's not true at Ryan. And I've even shared that with our CEO and our executive leadership team. That's personally painful. And I know there's so many other kids that feel the same way, right? So how can we all do the work so that our kids and their kids know that they have a place to be successful wherever?
And the workforce of the future has an expectation that we also have to meet. So that's a great point as well. Anne, did you want to weigh in on this as well?
Yeah, I think real quickly, one of the big ahas we've had this year is that DEI can be looked at not just as a cost center, right? And we actually are driving revenue, and I'm sure that's the case for everyone on the phone too. It's just a matter of tracking it. I can't tell you how many RFPs have been pulled into for our institutional customers asking about documenting metrics and documenting what are we working on and how are we driving equitable solutions. And that's one business. And I think it just goes to show, I think even CEOs are being held accountable for more than just shareholder customer pressure. Right. Institutional pressure around some of these is really going to drive that change. And we're collectively, I really do believe we're driving revenue, and that's the future.
Absolutely. Ryan, what are your thoughts on the desired future state? I would say the sports community may in fact be further ahead. I know there continue to be issues and challenges in every business, but what are your thoughts on the future state? What would you like to see?
Yeah, I mean, I love what Eric and Bryce, the future state. I mean, I try to put a filter through things of dreams, goals, plans, action, right? And so dreams is like this, think big, desired state. And I always think of that in terms of a picture. What does it look like? Goals is quantifiable, it's measurable. And as Bryce said, I love the ambitious 40% goal. You got to pick something that's a goal that's measurable. Plans are, how are you specifically going to get there? It's your strategic plan to go and reach that Bryce 40%. And then actions, what are you going to do today? So what's today? So to make it all seem a little less overwhelming of what that dream state is of inclusion, you can start to break down, downstream a little bit. And at the NBA, one of the things as Eric was saying, I was just thinking about is we've created what's called, and it's new, it was just launched, called the NBA Foundation. It's a $300 million program in which all 30 NBA teams have committed $10 million into this NBA Foundation. And it's a lot of money, right? And yet you start to think of it, what do you do with it? And so what we've started to build out is, educational programs. You got to start at the youth level. And how do you, one of the things I know a lot of people have become aware to is just the economic gap, or the educational gap, I should say, in Minnesota is really tough to see and stomach. And so how are you going to go and work on the educational aspect of this, right? First and foremost. Secondly, how do you help people get their first job, right? So the internships and the entry-level positions, and what are you going to do to recruit differently? And that's, personally something that I've just looked at and I always thought, why are we not getting people of color to apply for this role or this position? Well, that's not,
Sure.
that's a problem that we've got and where we're fishing
Yeah.
and how we're fishing and all of that stuff. So looking internally first on that one. And then once you get people inside the organization, how are we going to set them up for long-term sustainable success with mentors and senior leadership goals that mirror the hiring goals? And so you're not going to reshape your executive team, for those who are just beginning the journey overnight. And your business would, suffer if you tried to, jolt it that way. But you've got to have a plan to get to.
Pipeline matters, for sure.
So you've got to have a plan so that those people that are just entering your organization can look up and see somebody that looks like them and see somebody that, they can look to as a mentor and somebody that they want to, they envision themselves becoming.
Yes, absolutely. And so there is a certain amount from a representation perspective of counting people, making sure you're accountable there. Because if you look up and don't have representation, it is a symptom of a larger problem and likely a systemic one, even if it's the habits that we have and the practices. So there is that aspect of counting people. But there's also the aspect which you described, Ryan, so well, of making people count. So how do we change their life experience, their education experience, economic opportunity through what we can do within the power of our enterprises? So counting people, making people count is really an engine for the future state. Philomena, I will give you the last word on this question before we break, and then we take the audience questions and have a good conversation with them. But Philomena, what are your thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, I think everyone has added some really good points. And I think the piece is what do we do, right? So you can have the very best strategy and it can be pages and pages, but what is the action? And I think, what I've seen is it's got to be integrated throughout the organization, from the senior leadership to whatever you call the middle. I like the different terms, to the grassroots,
yeah.
right? And then I think it's the internal and external. So what do we do within our organizations to create that culture? And one of the pieces that I think has been powerful as a result of what's happened in our country is the group, people coming together to help solve, right? So our CEO is a part of the Business Roundtable. Maybe many organizations are a part of that. There's a focus on racial equity and justice. And so what happens when we all get together to do that? There's a Minnesota coalition here in Minnesota looking at public policy, right? Workforce. What happens when we share? Like Best Buy has some awesome things they're doing, Ryan companies, right? So when we collaborate, I think we can solve some of these bigger systemic issues in our country, right? So it's kind of organization, but broader, of working together.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so that future state, in terms of, and there's an example on the screen for the folks following the slides, activism, understanding, engagement, performance, all comes from inclusive behaviors. And we are going to encounter challenges. People have biases that are deeply rooted. There will be organizations that are resistant to change and who say, hey, we've been at this for so many years. And they have the rooted competing priority of preserving the very profitable status quo or moving with the culture that Eric described as the culture that's going to eat strategy for breakfast. So what's it going to be? How do we get people to release their comfort zone and truly engage? So if we move to the next slide, the first box shows a bicyclist on a smooth trajectory to the checkered flag and finish line. The second image is the reality. So there's a moat, it rains, there's hills to climb, it's rocky, it's stormy, it's terrible, actually. But pressing through the challenge is worth the reward. And I think that's why we all took time to have this first part of our conversation, because we do want to get to that positive future state. So in terms of next steps from a courtside activism perspective, panel, before we go to the Q&As after our break, one piece of advice. If you're just a single individual, what's the one thing that you would say you can do to begin to make a change for yourself today? Eric, do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, I'll tell you, I don't think anybody on this panel started off in this place or role they're in today. And my DEI journey started when I was an individual contributor, and recognizing there were places where people were not being included or their voices not being heard, and ensuring that they had an opportunity to be heard. And so all of us have influence, and in those spaces where you can use that influence to lift others up, I think you have both the responsibility and the privilege to do so. And so I would tell you to start from the space you're in and start with the highest leader that you have access to.
Great advice. Start now with whatever you have and do the best you can is some fantastic advice. Anne, what's your thought?
My new mantra is access. And I think about access every day from the standpoint of whether we're talking about, a diverse talent pool, providing people opportunities to supplier diversity and giving other businesses opportunities to shine, whether it's in the community and where our foundation dollars go. Access to me can be a really strong organizing principle for how we grow this as a strategy across the organization. So just that one word.
Sure. Fantastic. Now, Philomena, I know you won't be with us for part 2, the Q&A session. So do you have one piece of advice in terms of an individual? We've learned that we all can lead. Access is a powerful word. What is your thought?
Yeah, I'm going to say learning always, it's with your family, right? Within your organization, within the community, because things are always changing. So don't stand still and be curious. Like, can you tell me more, Tracy? Like, I'm really interested. And then I listen. So learn and listen.
Yes.
The 2 L's. And sorry, Steve, I have another panel I'm going to. So I hope it goes well for the next round.
Well, we're so glad you were with us, Philomena. Thank you so much. Bryce, do you have your power word and your advice?
I love what everyone shared, and I would add just broaden our network and specifically find people who think completely differently than you do, and both in our personal lives and in our professional lives, and all the places they intersect.
I think that's something we'll explore on the other side of this break, because diverse teams are difficult, but they get the best outcomes. So we'll talk about that as well. Ryan, you get the last word. We have 30 seconds before we go to break. What's your one nugget of advice?
It was talked about early, get uncomfortable. And I think that's something that I see with even young staff, and that can mean, just going to Starbucks together. Don't just go with the person that looks like you. And then I see it every day, groups of young men, white men, going to grab lunch, or groups of women that go to grab lunch. I think the opportunity exists when you actually get uncomfortable and, cross over and start to invite somebody that may not look like you to go and build that relationship. And I think that carries as people grow.
Yes, fantastic words of wisdom from our fantastic panel and the great companies they represent. We're so excited to have you. I'm going to turn it over to our leader, who is going to take us all to break. And on the other side of the break, we will come back and take your questions.
Thank you, Tracy. And if you haven't entered your questions yet in the Q&A function, please do that now. We will break and be back at 11:25. See you then.
Friends, we are back for our conversation on courtside activism. And I think the phrase courtside activism, while we wait for our panelists to rejoin us, is so significant because we're watching things happen, but we also have an opportunity to be a participant. And what does that activism look like? We don't want to be courtside the entire time. It's a tremendous opportunity to get into the game. So I'm so excited to have our panelists back with us, Anne, Bryce, Eric, and Ryan. And Whitney has some questions for us. And we are going to now turn it over so that we can get the questions answered from you, the audience. So do we have questions coming in? And while we are teeing up the questions, panel, during the break, we were talking about how we essentially move forward in thawing the middle to some degree. So maybe you can share your perspectives on just driving the change one person at a time.
Sure, I'll start off. One of the things that we were talking about is a bit around approach, and that everybody's sort of starting in this journey from a different place. And I know there's some other DE&I practitioners on the call. And I think it's important that, as we discuss these conversations, that we keep in mind that we can't always start from what I would consider the most complex and sometimes most controversial topics. So those are the ones that are getting the most press and have the buzzwords that you see, whether it be, white fragility or privilege and supremacy, all those things. But those are also the things that are, in many cases, the most offensive. And so you end up creating barriers. And so I think part of our job is, how do you build bridges more so than barriers? It doesn't mean we ignore those topics. It doesn't mean we don't discuss them, because we have to have the courageous conversations. But I think we have to be strategic in our approach and our tactics to ensure that we draw in as many people as possible into the conversation. Because when you do that, you actually lose some of the dissenting points of view that you actually need to be effective in this work. You actually want those people to have different points of view or disagree, because when they provide that insight, in many cases, it gives you the understanding on how to approach that conversation or how to draw them in. And so I'm very purposeful with my team, and as I talk with leaders on how we do that.
Absolutely. So we do have some questions coming in. One is from Anna Loris, and Eric, you just kind of addressed that. As we're thinking about hosting courageous conversations, what does that look like, and how should we start if that's new to our organization? So does anyone have additional examples of that? Courageous conversations are not easy, but they are impactful.
Yeah, I'll finish my thought. Oh, go ahead, Anne. I apologize.
Oh, no, go ahead. I'll go after you.
Our organization actually started something called Candid Conversations after the Fidel Castillo shooting in Minnesota. So one of the individuals on my staff, his name's John Hardy, recognized that many individuals that day were not engaging in the same way. And when I say many individuals, it was the Black employees on the corporate campus. Because for them, this was a visceral moment and something that they were internalizing. And what they were struggling with is that they were experiencing this deep pain, whereas many of their colleagues were going through the day like nothing had actually happened. And
Right.
so what he did is he actually created a venue where people could come together and talk about these really challenging issues. And since then, every month, the organization has held something called Candid Conversations. And so, the benefit of that is when all of this social unrest happened, we already had a mechanism or a platform to actually draw people in and discuss and share. What shifted is we're all virtual now, right?
Yeah.
So they used to happen in a room. where, you do miss a little bit of the interpersonal interaction, but the blessing of it being virtual is you went from hundreds of people at a time to tens of thousands or thousands of people at a time that can engage in the conversation virtually, even if sometimes it's just by chat or email or by listening.
Absolutely. And from the room to the Zoom, I think one of the foundational things is having ground rules, which means you have to assume positive intent of all the participants and suspend your right to be offended and reactionary, but really get into the listening mode that we talked about earlier. So we start our courageous conversations with those ground rules so people understand it's safe space for everyone and everyone's views will be respected. And you wanted to get in on this question, and then we'll take another question from the audience.
Yeah, Tracy, you nailed it with the norms. I think you got to do that at the outset. I think the other thing that we focused on too is the takeaway. Give folks one thing that they can do out of that conversation that they can do differently, and maybe it's something that they bake into the the everyday inner workings of their day, whether it's hiring people or being more inclusive during meetings. Just give them one takeaway, an action that they can think about.
Absolutely. Anyone else want in on the courageous conversation question before we move on? Bryce or Ryan?
No, I'm good.
Okay, so let's move to the question from Jennifer Lee. Who are going to be your partners or change agents within the organization, especially in organizations where cultural shifts are challenging? And that could be any organization, Jennifer, but panel, what do you think about that? Who are the change agents if you're trying to initiate a more inclusive culture? Where do you start?
I'll jump in. One, you have to have, an organization, whether it's an owner or CEO, depending on, your organization, it has to start there. And I can tell you, having seen this transformation, lived through this transformation, our current CEO, Ethan Caston, it starts the executive team and what that looks like and who is comprised and what representation looks like on an executive team, a senior leadership team, underneath that, the director level, you start to see it, spread positively through the organization, when it lives at the top. So one, it has to start at the very top of an organization with belief, passion, all of it, accountability against it. Two, and I just love, by the way, the role that I believe all of you serve for your organizations, focused DE&I roles inside of an organization. It's relatively new, and it's so important. And to see that as a person or a department, depending the size of the company, that's how real change starts to happen, when somebody's living, breathing, owning it every single day on behalf of the organization. We've got, talent acquisition here, and we're lucky, being a big brand and a big global brand. We get hundreds of applicants for every opportunity. So it goes to the folks in our human resources group and our talent acquisition side of it, of just how are we going to filter and make sure that the talent pool is representative of our community and our goals, and making sure every opportunity that is posted, we've got, if it's a final 3 or 4 finalists, that is a diverse finalist pool of both gender and racially diverse and backgrounds. And so I think those are 3 off the top. And then I guess lastly is just in organizations maybe that are just getting going. There's a lot of help externally you can look at too, which is you don't have to do this alone. There's consultants that you can have right in our community. There's organizations. We've got a lot of external partnerships that are experts in these spaces that can help guide you along the way.
Yes, absolutely. Other questions, friends? Other answers to the question? Thoughts on that? Okay, let's move. Oh, go ahead, Anne. No? Okay. Let's move to a question from Lisa Woodson. When you consider recruitment practices, what do you think is the number one thing to reconsider, reframe, or just think differently about to drive both diversity and inclusion. So now we're talking about recruiting to build representation. What are your thoughts on that?
Can I give you a quick answer for that? And I'd love to hear that. I would actually first really try to understand if you have a recruiting problem. Because one of the things that I hear just about every day from fellow employees is people think they can recruit their way out of a diversity problem. And what they don't recognize is they've got talent on their teams that they're not cultivating, that they're not developing. So I think that's step number one. You have to look at the data and actually understand, do you have a turnover problem or do you have a recruiting problem?
Right. Great point. And I see Catherine is back and has joined us. So Eric, I think you had a thought to finish and then we're going to conclude. But I want to thank you all so much for your great ideas, feedback, and leading great companies in the inclusive direction. Eric, final thought, and then Catherine, it's all yours.
Yeah, I'll just add to my new friend Ann's comment. I think you can clearly look at where does your diverse representation fall within your organization. And in many cases, it's at the lower levels of your organization and what's the ability of that talent to grow within the organization. And then you got to get really purposeful about how do you place talent and how do you recruit and onboard talent, because you got to have both of those strategies working in tandem in order to truly have inclusion, diversity work within your organization.
Great note to end on. Catherine, what do you think?
I'm ready to go. I'm ready to move on here. Awesome. Yes. I think it's great. I think, what a great way to start any day, but especially a Friday. I think, we are so fortunate, and this isn't in my speech, I've just been listening, and to have all of you as leaders in the Twin Cities doing this work, helping with uncomfortable conversations and leading us with real, authentic conversation. I just feel like we're lucky. I feel like this is a great place to be, a great place to live, and I'm really excited about the future here. So thank you so much to our panelists. You guys were fantastic. Tracy, as always, you're just so great. I just love seeing you. So thank you. Next, I'm going to move on to introduce you to our keynote speaker today, Cheryl Reeve. I know Ryan mentioned how fantastic she is. She's general manager and head coach of the Minnesota Lynx. And to help set the stage, you will first see a quick recap of the Lynx season video. And this is fantastic. So let's watch.
In training camp, you could feel it. You could feel the chemistry that you guys have talked about. So I just know that it's important. Every team I've ever been around that had success has that very important trait of being selfless and playing for each other, with each other, like that desire. This group had it. All the players say that was the most special part of it.
Lynx on three, ladies. 1, 2, 3. Lynx.
I love this team. I love the coach, everybody in the leagues. For me, this is my family in America.
We're tough. It's a lot going on. We're counted out, overlooked. We're tough.
I also learned just throughout the season how much I love my teammates and how important it is to have that good chemistry, because it makes up for a lot. We proved a lot of people wrong this year.
They sacrificed so much and handled it so great. That's why I just told them I was just so proud of them. Couldn't have gone any better for us, this experience. And everybody just poured everything into it.
We're going to use our platforms to draw attention to social injustice.
It has to start somewhere, so we have to do what we can.
It means everything to me that we have the platform that we have, but to also have a company that's backing you and pushing you to voice your own opinions.
People look up to us, so it's important for us to use our platform in a positive way.
It's not Black versus white, it's everyone against racism, anybody versus police brutality.
Everybody is paying attention finally to what's happening in our country, the injustices that Black people face every day.
Our hearts are with Miss Tamika Palmer. It has been 195 days since her daughter Breonna Taylor was killed. We won't stop pressing for full transparency and full and complete justice.
We all live in this country, and if you want to see things change, you have to vote.
We have a voice, we have an audience that is listening, is watching.
This point in time in Bridgeton right now in this bubble is going to be the true stamp of us making a change.
I'm shaking. Nobody expected this team. I'm just really happy. It's happy tears. we're fighting for Sil. We want to win this for her. And then just this team, nobody expected us to be here.
Sil, you are the all-time greatest rebounder in the history of the WNBA.
It's a great feeling. It's such an honor.
Receiving 44 out of 47 votes from a national panel of sports writers and broadcasters to win the 2020 WNBA Rookie of the Year, Crystal Dangerfield.
How bright is the future for this Lynx team?
Very. It's one of the reasons Cheryl Reeve got my vote for Coach of the Year. I don't know how many people expected them to be able to secure the 4 seed. Just a terrific job. Their starting 5 was the youngest starting 5 in the WNBA, so they've got a lot to look forward to in the upcoming seasons.
And no surprise, one of the greatest coaches this league has ever seen, getting the most out of her team this year.
This was a special season, as we just shared with players, a special group that accomplished special things together. We've got some really good key pieces to keep the franchise moving forward and keep us a playoff team. It's still a pretty darn special team.
Lynx on 3, ladies, 1, 2, 3, lead!
Hello. Just want to say thank you so much for the opportunity to be a part of something so special. We really appreciate the Minneapolis-St. Paul Business Journal's partnership with the Minnesota Lynx, and then obviously to be a part of this very important conversation. It's a business. That is a phrase that we hear often to hold marginalized groups down. This is a phrase that I'm familiar with in my career path, being a woman and being a part of women's sports, a marginalized group. And the good news, and I'm here to tell you that the idea of diversity and inclusion not being good for business is not borne out in analytics. We come from sports now, where analytics and studies are a big part of what we do. And so the good news is that what we've learned is that diversity and inclusion is absolutely good for business. The Minnesota Lynx and the WNBA have long been champions of fighting the fight for all marginalized groups. The involvement in countless initiatives for the empowerment of young girls, speaking out on the importance of not only gender but ethnic representation in leadership roles. We've stood on the Capitol steps in support of marriage equality, and we boldly committed to the social justice reform movement long before George Floyd. Within the Lynx culture, we believe in creating ownership and accountability before we can achieve our on-court success. Within the Lynx culture, we believe in creating ownership and accountability that's necessary for all of us involved to feel invested. And before we can achieve on-court success, we invest a great deal of time into our players and finding out who they are, what they believe in, so that we can fully provide for them. It's more than basketball. They're more than just players to us. We draft and trade for diversity. And then we include, we foster inclusion. It is so important for me. It's not just me coaching. It's not, let's put them in the right spots. It is first and foremost for me to know who they are as people. And so I want, and I find it very important, and matter of fact, I talked with the team about this summer, being their authentic selves is the best thing that we can all do for each other. I want them to allow me to be my authentic self, as challenging as that may be for them. I want them to be their authentic selves, whatever that might mean. They're there for a reason. It's not just about the basketball. I want to make sure that I'm surrounding myself and our group with people that come from all different backgrounds, that have a variety of thoughts on things, and no one should be silent in those things that are important to them. Our staff works really, really hard to form a connection. You know, we spent a lot of time virtually this season getting to know our players so that when we get on the court, there is this feeling of wanting to compete with and for each other. We believe that that investment is what allows us to reach our fullest championship pedigree. This summer, we were taken back to 2016 and the great work, the bold step that our franchise took in speaking out on the need for reform with regard to the ways that our communities are policed. In 2016, I had a leadership team, and we're very big on the idea that we select our leaders, we give them a voice. And in that voice, I feel that it's my responsibility as a leader to give them the most space possible. Leadership should not just be a title. Leadership is a responsibility. I push them towards being active in the ways that they lead. And in 2016, in Uncasville, Connecticut, we had a kind of a defining moment, I believe, in our franchise's history, in the way in which that we were going to involve ourselves, immerse ourselves into our community. That morning was a Thursday morning in Uncasville, Connecticut. It was game day. We were about to take on the Connecticut Sun. And we were preparing for our game prep in our morning, what we call our shoot around. And I remember waking up and to the news, you know, as we wake up, you know, we all log on to some form of learning about the current events. And that morning, there was yet another police officer involved shooting. A few days prior, there was a shooting in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and you all may recall that one of the greatest players to ever play for the Minnesota Lynx, Simone Augustus, was from Baton Rouge. And I remember Simone talking, we were in practice, and she was sharing with her teammates that the place where the shooting occurred was a place that she frequented outside of a store that she knew very well. So it was very personal to her. So we had that moment. And then we woke up on Thursday morning to a shooting in St. Paul. So right here at home, Philando Castile was murdered by the police. And I remember waking up and I felt such pain for our community and pain, like real pain for our players. I remember feeling that morning that the game didn't matter. I remember feeling that was probably the last thing that was on our players' minds. And so as we gathered for shoot around, I took our four captains and I said, I don't care about the game tonight. And they just kind of looked at me. And I felt that was a moment where it was time for us to do something, that they no longer had to just accept this. And that's what we preach a lot in our franchises, that you get what you accept. And in this case, it felt really wrong not to acknowledge the gravity of what was happening outside of basketball, and that you do get what you accept. And I did not want them to accept what was happening in Black and brown communities with regard to police brutality. It took locations close to us for us to really feel the call to action. And so we gathered, and I pushed them towards getting their heads together and not worrying about the game. And I just wanted them to sort of strategize and organize and see in which ways that we could thoughtfully use our voices and use our platform. I believe that we have a team that our community truly admires and trusts in the way that we conduct our business. And this was our time to be more than basketball players. And so we put our words into action. We spent a lot of time in organizing very thoughtfully the ways in which we would express ourselves about what was happening in our community. We thought that it was really important that our fans know that we all come from different backgrounds and we all have different beliefs, but we really believe that no rational person could be okay with the ways in which a Philando Castile murder would occur. I believe giving people the space, that's the inclusion part, giving them the space to express themselves in whatever form. You know, the four captains all had a different role in this. And to see them collectively organize and be a part of a press conference, to really step boldly out there, to experience when you do things like this, it takes a great deal of courage, number one. Because the first thing you're told is when you speak out more than an athlete, that people won't watch you anymore. People won't support you, come to the games, sponsor you. And I thought that was something I really wanted them to know, that our organization supported them at the highest levels. Change doesn't come without sacrifice. And if we're not willing to make a sacrifice, then who is? And we don't subscribe to the idea that players should just play basketball or whatever sport. We believe that we are leaders in the community, and leaders in the community are a part of all these conversations. The WNBA 2020 season. I think about when we embarked on, when we got to April, when the start of training camp, we're in the midst of a pandemic. Everything was virtual. And here we are, new drafted players. We had players that we signed in free agency and traded for. And it was a new process for us. A lot of those players that were a part of the 2016 social justice reform movement that we so boldly entered into that space, that this group, we were just getting to know each other. Here we were again as the Minnesota Lynx. We were reshaping our identity. But the mission was the same, that we were learning about each other. I was giving them that space to say, who are you? What are you about? And next thing you know, we're thrust into not even the midst of a pandemic, but in late May, another murder. This one was different. In that immediately I shared with our players about the group in 2016 and the ways in which that we used our voices so courageously. But this one was more about when in 2016, when we'd said Black Lives Matter, it was a phrase that was taken as, in some cases, such an affront to people. It was a risky phrase. It was something that if you put Black Lives Matter on your shirt, the police were going to walk out and not be a part of protecting you that night at your game. And here, fast forward to 2020, and the George Floyd murder led us to the Black Lives Matter movement. And I remember with this young group, this group that was new and wasn't a part of 2016, I remember how important it was to share with them the sacrifices, the difficulty, the ways in which we felt we did well and advanced the conversation forward, but then also, more importantly, the overwhelming feeling that I had was how much there was left to do. And I felt a level of disappointment that we weren't able to keep that conversation going. And this group felt a greater fortitude about the ideas of this has to come back front and center, and they wanted to be a part of it. It was, inclusive of voices. It's not just about having diversity, it's about giving them spaces to express themselves in whatever ways that they see fit. I had players that immediately wanted to jump into action and use their social media platform, partner with our franchise. I had one player that felt passionately about the answer was voting. And so we supported in ways down in the WNBA bubble to amplify their voices. I had some that I remember being on on the Zoom calls with our players. We would meet weekly, sometimes more than weekly, and we would talk basketball. We would talk about ways that we needed to prepare ourselves as we were at home trying to prepare as professional athletes for the go of our season. And I remember when George Floyd was murdered, that literally all that we had on the docket to teach with regard to basketball, we put aside. We basically canceled. And all of our conversations were about giving them space. And we have players from other countries. Damiris Dantas from Brazil. I have Canadians. We have a player that's from Italy. And we allowed them all to talk. We talked to, Brazil, the difficulties in Damiris, so sort of the depth of the pain that she was feeling. Each player, taking a moment and talking, and also talking about the way forward. I think that's probably most important, is when you identify something. Let's not just talk about it, let's be about it. Let's be a part of the change. So what's next? What do you do next? And so then comes the WNBA 2020 season, where our commissioner, Kathy Engelbert, and works so closely with the Players Association to develop basically the reason why we were going to play in 2020. This was about Say Her Name. This was about the vote campaign. This was about stopping playing when Jacob Blake was shot in the back 7 times by an officer in Kenosha, Wisconsin. This was basketball, but this was the epitome that this is what we do is more than basketball. I think the players felt so included to be a part of such a special season like the 2020 WNBA season. The design on the basketball court, literally the players had a say in everything that we were doing. Black Lives Matter on our court. So we were able to be on national TV, even worldwide in Brazil, that it was clear why what was important to the WNBA. Not only are you going to watch us and enjoy the great talents of WNBA players, some of the best athletes in the world, you were going to also understand that we're people and what matters to us. To achieve a diverse and equitable company, you must be committed. Something I say often to our players, are you just interested in playing defense, or are you committed to playing defense? There's a very, very big difference. Interested in something means that you'll do some things. You won't maybe necessarily follow through. The idea of being committed takes a much deeper dive. Diversity and inclusion is definitely, it's more than policies or programs or head counts. I don't think you need me to tell you that recruiting from a diverse pool of candidates means a more qualified workforce, or that diversity in the boardroom is needed to leverage a company's fullest potential. Employees who feel their voice is heard at work are nearly 5 times more likely to feel empowered to perform their best work. By respecting the unique needs, perspectives, and potential of all of their team members, truly diverse and inclusive workplaces earn deeper trust and more commitment from their employees. And that's what I feel like our team is about. That who they are as people, and me giving them that space that we understand and we empower and we amplify one another. That allows us to be the best version of ourselves so that we can be champions both on the court and off the court. And I can't tell you how fulfilling that experience is. When I was in my 20s, it was about being a great basketball coach. All I wanted to do was X's and O's. And then you move through life and you understand that it's not about that. Diversity without inclusion is like defense without rebounding. So you not only need a diversity of thought, and diversity comes in a variety of ways. We've talked a lot about racial inequities in the last 20 minutes, but this is about gender. This is about diversity of thought. This is about those with disabilities. There are many forms of diversity, and it all has to come in its fullest way to empower everyone that's in your workplace. That's the secret sauce. I talk about this. It's the secret. Everybody asks, what is it? The secret sauce is creating the desire to compete with and for one another. When you love each other, when you look over to next to you and you feel like you understand and you have a genuine love for the other person, you're going to be at your very, very best. What are you doing daily to advance your culture? If you come to our practice, I've always believed this. If you come to our practice, if you walk into any other sports teams in their practice, and you spend a couple days without seeing their practice plan, you should walk away knowing what that team's strengths are. So when you go watch them play, you'll know that if this team is good at defending and rebounding, which is what we believe in, you're going to see it reflected in our daily practice plan. So the same is true for diversity and inclusion. When I walk through your corporation, what am I going to see? And then more importantly, what am I going to hear from your employees? Not only are you diverse because you feel like it's the current thing to do, or are you diverse because you know it's good for business? It's the right thing to do. There's the social component to it. But when you can marry the social component to it with the business aspect of it, that's the utopia. Companies should build a culture where all employees feel they can bring their whole selves to work. I'm often asked, what can I do personally? What can leaders of a company do? That's a very simple answer. Completely immerse yourself into providing the most diverse and inclusive environment possible. Gender expression. Your words matter. The things that you provide for your employees, look around and take inventory of what you have and ask yourself, do you truly have a diverse and inclusive environment? Individually, again, words matter. The things that you say, whether you say it or you hear a coworker say it or another leader say it, it needs to be talked about now. Those difficult conversations need to be had. You need to have the courage to do that and know that it's your responsibility. It's not just the CEO of the company. It's everyone's responsibility to be a part of that. Take inventory. Be intentional. What do you support? Be intentional about where you spend your money. Am I going to support a company that perhaps isn't a believer in the success of diversity inclusion for all? I just want to say thank you once again for allowing us to be a part of such an important conversation. I also want to say a very special thank you for the ways in which this community has been so supportive of the Minnesota Lynx franchise, not only in our quest to win championships, but also the ways in which you have supported us off the court. I hope you will enjoy the rest of today's event, and I sure hope to see you at a Lynx game soon.
Thank you, Cheryl. What a great way to start our Friday. Thank you so much. Once again, I would like to thank our presenting sponsor for partnering with us today, RSM, and also thank you to our amazing panelists and our keynote speaker for sharing their expertise. It was fantastic. And we want to invite you to stick around until 12:15 to enjoy the interactive event platform. Make sure to visit one of the resource lounges as well. And thank you all for attending today's discussion, and we hope to see you again at the next Business Journal event. Have a great rest of the day. Have a great weekend. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.